Before we dive into the incredible adventures of Anansi, Africa's Trickster God of Stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more fascinating tales from the rich world of African mythology and history, because what you are about to hear will take you on a journey through forests, villages, and the very imagination of human culture, a journey where cunning, wisdom, and mischief collide in ways that will captivate your mind and heart. For Anansi was no ordinary spider, no simple creature who spun webs merely to catch flies or adorn the corners of a humble hut. He was a figure of immense cleverness, a master storyteller, a cultural icon whose influence stretched across generations and continents, a being who could trick kings and commoners alike, manipulate the natural and the supernatural, and teach humans lessons about humility, cunning, and the power of intellect over brute force. And it all began in the lush, dense forests of the Ashanti people in what is now Ghana, where the first whispers of Anansi's clever exploits began to echo, carried by the winds, sung by griots around fire-lit villages, and passed down orally from one generation to the next. For in the earliest times, the world was full of spirits and gods who watched over the land. But humanity needed guidance, entertainment, and wisdom, and Anansi, with his 8 spindly legs, mischievous eyes, and a mind sharper than the finest spear, became the conduit through which knowledge and cunning flowed. For he did not merely play tricks for his amusement, though he certainly enjoyed laughter and chaos. He spun stories that revealed truths about human nature, survival and morality, and as the tales went, Anansi's fame grew until even the Sky God Nyame could not ignore him. For it was said that Nyame had in his possession all the stories of the world, hidden like precious gems locked away so mortals would not have them. And yet Anansi, small yet formidable, approached Nyame with boldness that defied his size, claiming he could obtain these stories and bring them to humanity. And so began the challenge that would mark him forever as the supreme trickster, a creature whose intelligence could outwit the gods themselves. And in one legendary tale, Nyame, curious yet wary, agreed to Anansi's proposal, setting impossible tasks to deter the spider, for he was clever but also persistent. And Anansi faced challenges that would have broken the spirit of any ordinary creature. He was tasked with capturing the fearsome python, the hornets, and even the leopard, each considered untamable, dangerous beyond reckoning. And yet Anansi, with his mind ever turning, devised cunning solutions, for he reasoned that size and strength could not be matched by wit. And so he approached the python not with force but with clever words, convincing the massive serpent to coil itself in a way that Anansi could measure it accurately to fit a small box. And he tricked the hornets by charming them into a gourd, and with the leopard, he employed decoys, shadows, and distraction, showing that intelligence could bend nature's power to one's advantage. And when Anansi returned with these impossible creatures, Nyame, astonished and impressed, kept his promise and released all the stories into Anansi's hands, thus making Anansi the keeper of tales, the ultimate storyteller whose web was not just silk but knowledge itself. And from that moment, humanity had access to wisdom, parables, and lessons hidden in the folds of Anansi's narratives, for he traveled from village to village, tree to tree, weaving stories that contained morals, guidance, and laughter, teaching children courage, adults humility, and elders that even the smallest can achieve greatness with cleverness. And these stories were never merely entertainment. For Anansi's tricks often carried profound lessons. The lazy would learn to respect diligence, the greedy would discover the value of sharing, and the proud would find humility through clever reversals. For in every tale, Anansi showed that the universe had order, but it was not always enforced by force. It could be influenced by wit, insight, and creativity. And as the tales spread beyond the forests of Ghana, Anansi became more than a spider. He became a cultural icon, a deity of intellect and cunning, a symbol of the human capacity to use brains over brawn. And through the transatlantic slave trade, Anansi's stories journeyed across the ocean, carried in the hearts and memories of African people forced into the Americas, where he evolved into Aunt Nancy and other trickster figures, blending with local folklore to create a living tradition that preserved African heritage under unimaginable hardship. For even in the face of oppression, Anansi's lessons of cleverness, survival, and resilience persisted, teaching generations that no chains could bind the power of the mind. And the moral of each story, though often cloaked in humor or absurdity, was always unmistakable. Life rewards the clever, the perceptive, and the adaptable, And even the mighty can be humbled by the smallest if they underestimate intelligence. And as children listened to the crackling fires, parents whispered these stories and elders nodded knowingly. Anansi's legacy grew not as a mere myth, but as an eternal testament to human ingenuity, the persistence of culture, and the playful dance between chaos and order. For Anansi was never merely a teacher or a trickster. He was a mirror to human nature, showing that flaws, cunning, ambition, fear, and hope coexist, and that the stories we tell ourselves define who we are, who we become, and how we survive. And even today, when you hear of a clever plan, a daring trick, or a tale that ends with an unexpected twist, you are hearing echoes of Anansi, the spider whose webs contain the secrets of the world, whose laughter is immortal, whose lessons cross continents and centuries, whose very existence defies expectations, reminding us that in every shadow, every hidden corner, every whispered secret, there may lie a spark of genius, a lesson to be learned, a story to be told. And as Anansi's web stretches across time and space, connecting Africa, the Americas, and the world, it reminds us that intelligence, creativity, humor, and courage are eternal forces, woven into the very fabric of existence, a spider spinning not just silk, but the narrative of humanity itself, teaching that to survive, to thrive, to inspire, one must weave one's own path, entangle challenges with cleverness, and dance gracefully between the threads of fate, fortune, and freedom. And in doing so, Anansi becomes not only a myth, but a living symbol of how stories themselves carry the power to shape worlds. Hearts and minds forever inviting us to listen, learn, and create. As the stories of Anansi spread beyond the forests and villages of Ghana, they began to touch not only the hearts of Africans, but also those of people across the oceans. For the spider's tales carried universal lessons wrapped in laughter, mischief, and suspense. And each story was carefully designed to teach, to entertain, and to remind the listener that cleverness and wisdom could outmatch strength and power. And it was in this spirit that Anansi became a bridge between worlds, between generations and between cultures, as the first stories were passed from mouth to mouth, told by elders to children gathered around evening fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames, their imaginations ignited by the adventures of a tiny spider with the mind of a giant. For Anansi was not bound by his size, and his cleverness transcended the limitations of the natural world. And in one story, Anansi sought to hoard all the wisdom of the world for himself, believing that with such knowledge, he could become invincible, and he collected words, proverbs, riddles, and secrets, carefully hiding them in a gourd suspended high in a tree, thinking that no one could reach it. Yet his own son, seeing the gourd perched precariously, suggested that perhaps the wisdom should be shared with everyone, for hoarding knowledge serves no purpose if it cannot help others. And in that moment, Anansi realized that even the cleverest of beings could be taught lessons in humility and generosity. For true wisdom is not only in the accumulation of knowledge, but in its use for the benefit of the community. And so Anansi, humbled but undeterred, began to tell stories that contained the wisdom of the world, embedding advice, morality, and the essence of human experience into narratives that were unforgettable. And his reputation grew, so that when disputes arose in the village, when dilemmas seemed unsolvable, and when danger threatened the people, it was often said that one should think like Anansi, to consider cunning, timing, and cleverness over sheer force. And the spider, though sometimes selfish, mischievous, and comically flawed, reminded humanity that intelligence was the greatest tool, a resource more valuable than gold, more effective than weapons, and more enduring than brute strength. And through these narratives, Anansi also taught that mistakes are lessons in disguise, that hubris could lead to downfall, and that even the smallest creature could shape the course of events if it applied its mind wisely. And as his tales continued, Anansi's fame crossed rivers, mountains, and oceans carried by travelers, merchants, and eventually enslaved Africans, who clung to their stories as lifelines, memories of home and connections to their heritage. And in the Caribbean, South America, and the southern United States, Anansi became Aunt Nancy, or Br'er Rabbit, morphing into characters that retained his cunning and moral lessons while adapting to new lands. Yet at the heart of each story was always the same truth: wit, patience, and ingenuity can overcome overwhelming odds. And in the forests of Ghana, where the oldest tales were first whispered, the children would listen with wide eyes as Anansi outsmarted the leopard, tricked the python, and humbled the mighty hornets, and the elders would nod knowingly, passing on the moral that brains, not brawn, often dictate the outcome of life's challenges, and through generations, these stories preserved not just entertainment, but an entire worldview, one that valued cleverness, foresight, negotiation, and the art of thinking ahead. And in one particular tale, Anansi sought to teach greed and generosity simultaneously. For he had found a field of yams, plump and ripe, and instead of keeping them all to himself, he invited the village children to partake, watching closely as they debated, shared, or hoarded, illustrating through action the consequences of selfishness versus cooperation. And when some took more than their share, Anansi used clever tricks to ensure balance was restored, showing that even in play, life teaches profound truths. And in yet another story, Anansi's cunning was tested by the Sky God again. For Nyame had hidden the stars, keeping them locked away so humans would never know the beauty and guidance of the night sky. Yet Anansi, ever resourceful, negotiated, planned, and ultimately tricked the Sky God into releasing the stars, scattering them across the heavens where they remain to this day, illuminating the night, guiding travelers, and reminding humanity that cleverness, courage, and determination can reveal light even in the darkest places. And it is this blend of humor, daring, and insight that cements Anansi as the ultimate trickster hero, a character who entertains and educates, who challenges assumptions, and whose stories reflect the triumphs, flaws, fears, and hopes of humans themselves. For every tale, every twist, every cleverly devised scheme teaches that life is a game of wit, patience, and strategy, that challenges can be overcome not by force alone, but through intelligence, adaptability, and courage. And this philosophy carried far beyond the forests of Ghana, transforming into moral instruction, folklore, and literature across continents, surviving slavery, colonization, and cultural displacement. And even today, in African and African-descended communities worldwide, Anansi's presence is felt, celebrated, and revered. His story is a testament to resilience, ingenuity, and the enduring power of narrative to teach, inspire, and connect people across generations, making Anansi not just a spider, not just a trickster, but a cultural icon whose legacy transcends time, geography, and human imagination. As Anansi's tales spread across villages and towns, they evolved, adapting to the needs, fears, and dreams of each community. And while the spider often acted out of self-interest, his actions invariably carried lessons about the balance between cunning and morality. For instance, one story tells of how Anansi encountered the powerful elephant, who threatened the smaller animals with dominance and fear. Yet through a combination of clever distraction, strategic misdirection, and timely negotiation, Anansi was able to defuse the situation, not by fighting or confronting brute strength, but by outthinking it. And this story, told and retold around countless fires, reminded young and old alike that brains can overcome brawn when applied creatively. And in another narrative, Anansi faced the mighty python, who boasted of his size and power, claiming that none could match him. And while the other animals cowered, Anansi devised a plan involving mirrors, shadows, and false reflections that convinced the python of a far larger, more menacing force, leading him to retreat, thereby teaching the villagers the power of perception, strategy, and careful planning over direct confrontation. And yet these stories were never merely about victory, for Anansi's misadventures also included cautionary tales where his hubris led to trouble, such as the time he attempted to outwit the hornets to steal honey, only to be stung repeatedly when he ignored basic wisdom, showing that cleverness without respect for consequences can bring pain. And through these multi-layered narratives, the community learned resilience, patience, empathy, and the necessity of observing the world carefully before acting. And while Anansi's personality could be mischievous and selfish, the underlying moral currents were consistent. Every action has impact, every choice carries consequences, and those who are wise consider not only themselves but also the well-being of others. And as the stories were passed down, they became a living library of knowledge, culture, and philosophy, with elders teaching young ones not only about the plots but about timing, resourcefulness, ethical thinking, and the delicate art of negotiation. And over time, the figure of Anansi evolved beyond the forests, reaching traders, travelers, and eventually the African diaspora, carrying with him African cultural memory, moral reasoning, and a form of intellectual resistance against oppression. For in his wit and cunning, enslaved peoples found hope, a sense of continuity with their ancestral wisdom, and strategies for navigating complex social and survival challenges. And the tales continued to multiply, For Anansi was not a static character but a living legend, embodying both the trickster archetype and the collective intelligence of the communities that nurtured him. And through storytelling sessions that could last for hours, sometimes with songs, dances, and audience participation, the children and adults alike learned the importance of observation, ingenuity, humor, and humility, and they saw in Anansi both the potential for brilliance and the vulnerability of pride, teaching them that even the cleverest can be undone if they do not temper intellect with caution, empathy, and foresight. And in one of the most famous stories, Anansi sought to claim all the wisdom of the world in a single gourd, thinking that possession of knowledge alone equaled power. And yet it was his own son who reminded him that wisdom is not meant to be hoarded, and only when shared does it serve humanity. And this lesson reinforced community values, collaboration, and ethical thinking, showing that stories are not just entertainment, but a repository of cultural, moral, and philosophical truths. And even today, Anansi's lessons persist, inspiring writers, filmmakers, educators, and children's storytellers, reminding us that cleverness, when paired with morality and foresight, can shape destinies, resolve conflicts, and illuminate the paths of those who listen carefully. And in this way, Anansi continues to crawl across continents, generations, and mediums, forever teaching, forever entertaining, and forever connecting people to the enduring power of African oral tradition. As Anansi's legend spread across rivers, forests, and mountains, he became a symbol not only of cunning but of adaptability, teaching communities how to survive and thrive amid challenges both natural and social. And one story recounts how Anansi once faced a terrible drought, where the rivers ran dry, crops failed, and animals were desperate. Yet instead of panicking, he devised a plan to gather the elders, younger animals, and even humans, demonstrating the importance of collective action, foresight, and resourcefulness. And in another tale, Anansi was challenged by the mighty Lion King, who demanded that all the animals pay tribute. Yet Anansi, understanding that force alone could not be resisted, devised clever ways to redirect resources, outsmart guards, and redistribute wealth, teaching lessons about negotiation, strategy, and justice. And the stories also reveal Anansi's playful side, showing how humor, laughter, and creativity can relieve tension and foster unity. For example, he would disguise himself, mimic voices, and create elaborate pranks that ended in amusement rather than harm. And in these lighter tales, children learned that cleverness should be balanced with kindness, empathy, and consideration. And yet Anansi was not merely a source of amusement. He represented the eternal human struggle to balance intellect with ethics, ambition with humility, and desire with responsibility. And one story illustrates how he once tried to hoard all the yams of the village, thinking himself clever, only to have the community unite and teach him that selfishness breeds isolation, a lesson reinforcing social harmony. And in many narratives, Anansi interacts with supernatural beings, spirits and gods, negotiating, tricking, or learning from them, showing that intelligence must navigate not only the physical world but also the moral and spiritual dimensions of life. And his encounters with entities like Moadia, the forest spirits, or Nyame, the sky god, illustrate that knowledge and wisdom come from observation, respect, and understanding of forces greater than oneself. And over centuries, these stories formed a cohesive moral and cultural framework, passed orally from parent to child, elder to youth, ensuring that even without written records, communities retained an integrated view of ethics, social norms, and the importance of foresight, cleverness, and justice. And when the transatlantic slave trade dispersed African peoples across continents, the stories of Anansi traveled with them, evolving into new forms in the Caribbean, Americas, and elsewhere, teaching enslaved communities resilience, strategy, hope, and a cultural identity that defied oppression. And in these diasporic adaptations, Anansi's tales continued to be told at firesides, markets, and gatherings, often infused with local flavor, new characters, and contemporary moral dilemmas, proving the adaptability of African oral tradition. And in modern times, Anansi's stories have influenced literature, animation, and education, serving as tools for teaching critical thinking, problem-solving, ethics, and creativity. And the enduring appeal of Anansi lies in his duality: playful yet wise, mischievous yet instructive, self-serving yet instructive, offering a mirror of human nature and a roadmap for navigating life's complexities. And through all these narratives, communities learn that cleverness alone is insufficient without wisdom, that humor and empathy enhance intelligence, and that stories themselves are vessels of culture, memory, and identity, preserving lessons from centuries past while guiding future generations to approach life with creativity, mindfulness, and courage. Anansi's cleverness was matched only by his curiosity, and in countless tales he is portrayed exploring new lands, discovering hidden treasures, and inventing clever devices to solve problems or play pranks, for instance. There is a story where Anansi ventures into the river delta to teach the young fish how to avoid the eagle's talons, using twigs, leaves, and clever decoys to demonstrate safety strategies. While in another tale, he climbs the tallest baobab tree to retrieve the secrets of the clouds, negotiating with the wind spirits for safe passage and teaching audiences that ambition coupled with caution is a virtue. And yet another story describes how Anansi tricked the greedy tortoise, who hoarded all the sweet fruits of the forest, into sharing them with other animals by crafting a riddle so perplexing that only cooperation could solve it, illustrating lessons of fairness and intelligence. And Anansi's adventures often show him confronting the forces of greed, pride and anger, yet always emphasizing the importance of wit, patience, and diplomacy, and sometimes he even teaches humility, as when he attempts to hoard all the stories for himself, thinking he can control knowledge only to be taught by Nyame that stories belong to everyone, thereby instilling the idea that wisdom is communal, not private. And the tales also depict Anansi as a mentor to the young animals, guiding them through moral dilemmas, practical challenges, and social dynamics, reinforcing cultural values of honesty, courage, and compassion. And during times of famine, drought, or danger, Anansi's ingenuity saves entire communities, showing that intelligence and creative problem-solving are crucial for survival. And his stories are peppered with humor, misdirection, and clever wordplay, which make them memorable and engaging, ensuring their transmission across generations. And when Anansi crosses paths with humans, his actions often reveal societal lessons, such as teaching leaders the dangers of corruption, or reminding families to value cooperation and respect. And even in conflict, Anansi's cleverness is tempered by justice, as he rarely causes permanent harm, instead using mischief as a tool to enlighten, educate, and correct. And through these narratives, the listeners, whether children or adults, internalize a code of ethics, an understanding of consequences, and a deep appreciation for the balance between personal ambition and communal responsibility. And when the stories traveled across the African diaspora, Anansi became a symbol of resilience, adaptability, and the enduring power of culture, inspiring new tales in Jamaica, the United States, and the Caribbean, where he embodies the struggle for survival, the triumph of intellect over brute force, and the importance of storytelling in preserving identity, history, and hope. And in modern times, educators, authors, and media creators continue to adapt Anansi's stories, embedding them into books, animation, and games, teaching critical thinking, cultural literacy, and creativity. And across every retelling, one constant remains: Anansi is the bridge between the human and the divine, the playful and the wise, the individual and the community, a character who embodies the power of story itself, proving that narratives are more than entertainment. They are guides, moral compasses, and vessels of shared memory. And through Anansi, generations learn that life is a tapestry woven from wit, wisdom, courage, humor, and empathy. And that the clever spider, who walks between the worlds of animals, humans, and spirits, continues to inspire, teach, and enchant, showing us that intelligence, creativity, and heart are the true tools for navigating the mysteries of life. As the sun sets over the African forests and the Caribbean shores alike, the tales of Anansi the spider live on, spun from generation to generation, teaching that wit, patience, and courage can overcome even the greatest challenges, that humor can illuminate truth, and that every story carries lessons for those willing to listen. Children gather around fires, elders recount the clever spider's exploits, and in classrooms, books, and digital media, Anansi's presence continues to remind us that culture, wisdom, and moral guidance are intertwined in narrative, that intelligence is a force as mighty as strength, and that stories have the power to connect hearts across continents, centuries, and communities, proving that a single, clever spider can teach the world about resilience, justice, curiosity, and creativity, leaving behind a legacy as enduring as the woven webs he spins, a reminder that through stories we find ourselves, our histories, and the unbroken thread of human imagination stretching from Africa to every corner of the globe.